The 30-year-old Mustang barely had time to stop before the laughter started. Graham Keene pulled up to Sterling Crest Motors on a quiet Tuesday morning, and the sales team read him instantly. A middle-aged man in plain clothes driving a faded muscle car with a repaired seat seam and an old radio. They called him a walk-in with no appointment, blocked him from the display sedans, and quoted his Mustang at scrap value. Graham said nothing. He checked his watch, made one call, and drove to a competitor. Before noon, 25 vehicles carried his company name. The CEO stopped laughing. Subscribe to this channel right now, because that 30-year-old Mustang is about to make an entire luxury car empire pay very dearly for its arrogance. Graham Keene woke before sunrise the way he had every day for 12 years. Since the morning he became a single father and decided that being early was the only luxury he could reliably afford. The house on the south end of Belridge, Tennessee was modest by any standard. 3 bedrooms, a detached garage, and a kitchen that still carried the faint ghost of the coffee Nora used to make on Sunday mornings before the cancer took her 3 years into what should have been a long and ordinary life. Graham did not grieve loudly. He built things instead. He had started as a fleet systems engineer, spent 7 years developing software that helped logistics companies reduce maintenance costs and operational incidents, and eventually sold the licensing rights to a firm in Atlanta for enough money to launch something of his own. He called it Waypoint Mobility, and for the first 3 years he operated it from a spare bedroom, managing a fleet of 12 vehicles for a single hospital network and personally conducting every maintenance audit himself. The company that existed now, with staff across 2 states, contracts with airport authorities, hospital systems and corporate campuses, and a regional reputation built entirely on operational reliability, had grown in the way that companies grow when no one is performing for an audience, quietly, steadily, and almost entirely beneath the notice of people who only paid attention to things that looked impressive from the outside. Graham had never hired a publicist. He had never redesigned the office to impress visiting clients. He drove the same car he had driven for 25 years, lived in the same house he had moved into when Paige was 7, and declined every invitation to speak on a panel about entrepreneurship. The company's reputation spoke through its safety record and its contract renewal rate, both of which were the highest in its category in the region. That was the only kind of advertising Graham had ever trusted. That Tuesday, he dressed in khaki trousers and a plain button-down shirt, poured coffee into a travel mug, and walked through the side door into the garage where a 1996 Ford Mustang GT waited in the half-dark. The paint had gone slightly chalky at the roof edge after 3 decades of Tennessee sun and humidity. The driver's seat bore a clean seam where Graham had restitched the leather himself 3 winters back, using a kit Nora had ordered from a restoration catalog the year before she was diagnosed. The radio still had a slot for cassettes. The engine, however, was another thing entirely. Every gasket, hose, and bearing either original and immaculate, or replaced with a better part than the factory had ever fitted, and the idle that answered the starter settled into the low, even rumble of something old that had been cared for so well it refused to age. He had bought the car with Nora the year they married, at a small lot in East Nashville, and they had spent 3 weekends in their first rented garage pulling it apart and putting it back together better than it had been. The car was not old. It was finished. He let it warm for 2 minutes, then called his daughter. Paige Keene was 20 years old and studying industrial design 4 hours south. She answered on the second ring and asked, with the particular exasperation of a young woman who had raised this exact point before, why he wasn't taking one of the company SUVs to a meeting at a luxury dealership. He gave her the same answer he always gave. A business partner who couldn't treat him with basic respect before knowing what he was worth had already told him something essential, and he wanted to hear it before he signed anything worth millions of dollars. Waypoint had recently won a 3-year transit services contract from the city of Belridge and a regional technology consortium, and the first operational phase required 25 vehicles, 18 premium sedans, and 7 executive SUVs, all branded, insured, and deployment-ready before noon that same day to preserve fleet pricing and the 48-hour delivery window. Sterling Crest Automotive Group had submitted the most competitive bid and had the network to fulfill the order. On every spreadsheet prepared by Avery Sloan, Graham's chief financial officer, Sterling Crest was the obvious choice. What no spreadsheet had measured was the thing Graham had come to measure himself. He called it the lobby test. Walk into a potential partner's facility looking like nobody important and watch what happens before they know your name. As the Mustang turned onto the main boulevard and the glass facade of Sterling Crest materialized in the morning light, a young attendant near the entrance saw the car approaching, leaned toward the colleague beside him, and said something that made them both grin. Graham noted it and pulled into the visitor lane without changing his expression. Chase Danner had worked the Sterling Crest floor for 4 years and had developed what he considered an infallible system for evaluating a customer before they opened their mouths. The visible label on a watch, the cut of a jacket, the model year and condition of whatever sat outside. The Mustang told him everything he believed he needed to know. He walked out with his hands in his suit pockets, chin slightly elevated, and met Graham at the entrance without extending his hand. He asked, with the patient condescension of someone managing a low-probability interruption to their morning, whether Graham was there to trade the car in. Graham said he had a 9 o'clock appointment with the corporate accounts department. Chase looked at the Mustang a second time, then at Graham's plain button-down, and asked, not unkindly, which was almost worse, whether he was certain he had the right dealership. Inside, the morning light struck polished hoods that started at $60,000 and climbed from there. Chase positioned himself between Graham and the nearest display vehicle as though proximity to the inventory required a documented purchase history. When Graham stepped toward a silver sedan to examine the interior, Chase explained that the seat leather scuffed easily and that it was preferable not to sit without intending to buy. When Graham asked about scheduling a test drive, Chase said the vehicles required a deposit, and the deposit, he implied with just enough smile to be deniable, was likely more than the Mustang outside was worth. 2 colleagues drifted over from nearby desks, drawn by the particular low energy of an interaction they recognized. One suggested that the trade-in department was accessible through the back corridor, in case Graham had mistaken the entrance. The other picked up a tablet and appeared to photograph the Mustang through the glass wall, not yet understanding that the car contained a dashcam running continuously since that morning, recording everything in front of the windshield and everything visible through the cabin lens. A customer near the coffee station glanced over, then looked away. Another paused his conversation to watch. Graham did not raise his voice. He did not attempt to list his credentials or correct any of the assumptions being assembled around him. He stood in the center of the showroom with the same expression he used in board meetings when someone said something wrong in a confident tone, attentive, quiet, committing every detail to memory. On the far side of the floor, Lila Benton, who handled Sterling Crest's corporate fleet accounts from a glass-walled office, caught the name Waypoint in passing and paused mid-sentence. The paperwork on her desk that morning included a verified company profile and a confirmed 9 o'clock appointment that represented one of the largest single fleet purchases Sterling Crest had processed in several years. She stood and moved toward the showroom floor. She did not make it past Preston Hale. Sterling Crest's general manager had been watching from the mezzanine level and had descended with the unhurried confidence of a man who, in 17 years, had never discovered his first impression was wrong. He arrived beside Chase without asking Graham his name or what he needed, looked at the Mustang outside, looked at Graham, and said that Sterling Crest maintained a particular standard of client experience and preferred that individuals who weren't committed buyers refrain from occupying the sales staff's time. Graham reached into his shirt pocket and set a business card on the display counter. Preston glanced at it, the name Graham Keene, in plain type, and set the card on the hood of the nearest display vehicle, without reading the line printed beneath, which said Founder and Chief Executive, Waypoint Mobility. He told Graham that when his company could afford one of these cars, he was welcome to return. Graham asked whether this was the standard treatment for anyone who arrived without a suit. Preston said that in his experience, serious buyers didn't need to ask that question. Then he nodded toward the door. Graham picked the card off the display hood, pocketed it, and asked one final question in the same level tone he had used throughout. If he could prove he had the means to buy everything in that showroom, would Preston treat the next person who drove in on a Tuesday morning in an old car any differently? Preston smiled and told Graham to focus on buying one car before thinking about more. Graham thanked him and walked out into the sun. Lila moved the moment Preston turned toward his office. She pulled up the intake calendar, confirmed the 9 o'clock appointment was listed and active, verified that the account profile matched Waypoint Mobility's registered business information, and included a pre-authorized financial summary prepared by Avery's team, printed the screen, and walked directly into Preston's office to place it on his desk. He read it, set it down, and said someone had used a real company's name to gain access to the showroom floor. Lila pointed out that every contact detail in the profile had verified independently, that the financial summary had been prepared by a recognized law firm, and that the individual on the floor had given his name as Graham Keene, which matched the appointment record precisely. Preston said he had been doing this long enough to recognize a serious client, and that the conversation was over. What followed took less than 10 minutes. He accessed the showroom management system with his administrative credentials, located the Waypoint appointment in the 9 o'clock slot, and deleted it. He returned to the floor and announced, at a volume calibrated to be heard by the nearest customers without appearing to be raised, that the appointment in question had not been properly entered, and that the individual claiming to represent a corporate fleet had either arrived at the wrong location or was misrepresenting himself. Chase added, to the two colleagues within earshot, that it wasn't the first time someone had tried to use a company name for a free tour of the inventory. The ambient jazz on the showroom sound system gave the laughter that followed a quality that would have been difficult to describe precisely except that it was fully audible. Graham, still in the lot, checked the clock above the service bay entrance, 9:34. He had 2 hours and 26 minutes. He was about to call Avery when Lila appeared through a side corridor, walking quickly and glancing back toward Preston's office as she moved. She said his appointment had been real. She had seen it in the system herself before it was removed, and she said it without any visible attempt to redirect blame in a way that protected the building around her. Graham thanked her. He asked her to retain a copy of the original appointment record, note the positions of the showroom cameras, and what they had captured over the past hour, and keep her own copies somewhere outside Preston's access. He said the records might be needed, and he wanted to be certain they existed. Then he walked to the Mustang, started the engine, pulled out his phone, and called Avery Sloan. He said 3 words, cancel Sterling Crest. On the other end of the line, Avery exhaled once and started typing. She had prepared the Everett contingency in full 3 days earlier, knowing Graham's lobby test sometimes produced results that required it. The financial authorization was already in place. The specification documents were staged. All she needed was the word, and now she had it. Everett Motor Collective sat 12 minutes across town, past the informal boundary separating Belridge's luxury corridor from its working commercial district. A wide, clean lot, a modest showroom, American flags flanking the entrance, and a handwritten sign near the service bays that read "Every car matters here." Graham had driven past it a dozen times without stopping. He noted, pulling in, that the lot was full of customers, not performances. Graham pulled in at 10:02. A man in his 50s, wearing a company shirt over work pants, came out from the service wing, looked at the Mustang without any particular expression, and asked whether Graham needed the car seen to or was shopping for something new. Graham said he was shopping. The man said the showroom was open and walked him inside without noting the car's condition, its age, or any detail of Graham's appearance. The meeting at Everett lasted 11 minutes before it extended into something more substantial. Malcolm Everett was a mechanic who had built his business from a single service bay over 30 years, and that history was visible in the way he moved through his own facility, hands frequently in motion, eyes running over inventory and staff with practiced efficiency, pausing at the parts counter to address a technician by name. When Graham set a summary document on the desk and explained what he needed, 25 vehicles, precise configurations confirmed before noon, Malcolm read the page once without interruption and then asked what the vehicles would be used for. It was the first time that morning anyone had thought to ask that question. Avery joined by phone to verify financing as Malcolm called 3 branch managers in succession. What emerged from that 45-minute process was the difference between a company that knew its business and one that performed knowing its business. Rate structures appeared on the shared screen without being requested. Contract language was walked through clause by clause. When Graham identified a bundled feature package that Waypoint's fleet specs didn't require, Malcolm removed it and repriced downward without comment. No fees appeared in the margin that hadn't been named. When Avery flagged 3 vehicles in Malcolm's preliminary inventory list that didn't meet Waypoint's contract specifications, Malcolm pulled all 3 and sourced replacements from the Franklin branch. Higher specification and therefore higher cost, held at the price already quoted because the contract had been agreed in principle and the inventory error was his. 11 vehicles were on site. 14 had to be confirmed from branches in Franklin, Murfreesboro, Cookeville, and Clarksville. Malcolm made those calls himself, cross-referencing vehicle identification numbers against Waypoint's spec sheet as confirmations arrived. By 10:35, all 14 were confirmed and in transit. While this unfolded at Everett, Adrian Sterling arrived at the Belridge showroom at 10:45 for what she understood to be the ceremonial signing of the Waypoint fleet contract. Preston met her at the entrance and said the client had not yet appeared and might be running behind schedule. Adrian asked no further questions. She assumed a late arrival. Lila stood 20 feet away with the printed calendar entry folded inside her jacket pocket and kept her expression neutral. The showroom continued its ambient operations around them. Polished surfaces, soft music, the careful choreography of a business performing its own excellence. And nobody mentioned the blue Mustang that had been on the lot less than 90 minutes earlier. Adrian learned the truth at 11:03 when she called Avery's direct line to confirm arrival. Avery identified herself as Waypoint's CFO and explained, without drama, that Waypoint was no longer in discussions with Sterling Crest and was currently finalizing documentation with Everett Motor Collective. The call lasted 40 seconds. Adrian walked to Preston's office with her phone still in her hand. She listened to his account. The car, the clothing, the judgment call he described as reasonable given his experience, and told him to call Graham immediately, offer a meaningful price reduction per unit, and characterize the morning as an internal communications failure. Preston called and did not name anything that had occurred as wrong. He said Sterling Crest was prepared to overlook what had happened and suggested they reset the conversation. Graham pointed out that Preston had described a morning without naming what had occurred in it, and that the issue was not pricing but the decision his team had made about who deserved service before anyone knew what they could spend. He declined and ended the call. Adrian called next. Her voice carried a warmth that was professionally applied, the tone of someone who had managed investor relations and difficult press moments and understood the value of sounding present without conceding anything. She offered a price reduction worth $14,000 per unit across the full order, a complimentary 3-year maintenance package, same-day vehicle delivery, and a commitment that the employees involved would be addressed through the appropriate internal process. Graham asked whether Preston specifically would face any consequences for deleting a confirmed appointment and publicly ridiculing a client on the showroom floor. Adrian said personnel matters were managed internally, and the more productive focus was on what served both organizations going forward. Graham told her that respect was not a personnel matter. It was the precondition of any functional business relationship, wished her well, and ended the call. At 11:47, Graham Keene signed the master purchase agreement and 25 individual vehicle contracts electronically at Everett's conference table. The total transaction value was $2,140,000, with a separate long-term maintenance agreement worth $300,000 annually. Malcolm shook his hand the same way he had when Graham first walked in, directly, without ceremony. 4 minutes later, the sales data platform at Sterling Crest received the closure notification. Waypoint Mobility, closed lost, competitor field showing Everett Motor Collective. The flag populated the main dashboard visible to the entire management team. It was not the $2 million that produced the silence in Preston's office when Adrian's assistant pulled up the screen. It was the note Avery had attached when formally declining Sterling Crest's bid. Waypoint Mobility is in the first phase of a 72-month fleet build-out, with total projected acquisition of approximately 290 vehicles. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Adrian asked her assistant to close the door and told her communications team to prepare a statement. Sterling Crest's statement arrived by mid-afternoon and was carefully worded at every turn. It described a representative of an unverified company appearing without a confirmed appointment, entering restricted display areas without authorization, behaving in a disruptive manner towards staff, and declining a generous counteroffer because personal expectations had not been met. The phrase mutual misunderstanding appeared 3 times. Graham Keene's name appeared 0 times. Alongside the written statement, a short video clip entered circulation, 40 seconds of showroom footage showing Graham in conversation with Preston, posture steady, hands at his sides. The clip began after the salesman had gathered at the glass to mock the Mustang, and ended before Preston set Graham's business card on the hood of the display vehicle. What remained was footage of a man standing inside an upscale dealership appearing to dispute something, without any context explaining what had preceded the moment or why he was there. Public reaction divided in the pattern Adrian had anticipated. Some found the clip suspicious in its specific duration and questioned what surrounded it. Others concluded that a man with resources had staged a confrontation to manufacture grievance against an established brand. The second interpretation suited Adrian because it required no scrutiny of the institution itself. She had not calculated for what arrived at Sterling Crest's legal department by 2:15 that afternoon, a formal preservation demand from Waypoint requiring the company to retain all records, camera footage, and internal communications related to the morning, followed by a letter identifying a specific problem. The exclusivity clause Sterling Crest had asserted in its legal correspondence had not existed in the original meeting summary document. Avery had located the discrepancy in the document's own changelog. The clause had been inserted at 9:52 in the morning, more than 15 minutes after Graham had driven away from the lot, and the system's automated record had captured the edit timestamp with the precision that automated systems always retain. The preservation demand removed Adrian's ability to instruct anyone to archive or delete the relevant footage without triggering a separate obstruction claim. At 4:41 that afternoon, Lila called Graham from a personal number and spoke quickly and precisely. She confirmed that Preston had directed the system administrator to erase the original appointment from the client history log, had personally revised Graham's intake profile to read unverified walk-in, and had arranged for the security team to archive the relevant camera footage to a management-only drive before the standard recording loop could overwrite it. She also shared the contents of an email she had retained in her personal inbox, sent from Adrian's direct account to all 9 branch managers 6 months earlier under the subject line Client Experience Calibration, which instructed staff to prioritize clients whose appearance and vehicle aligned with the brand's image profile. The criteria were specific: visible clothing labels, vehicle year and model, residential zip code, professional designation in intake paperwork, and assessed likelihood of purchasing optional high-margin service packages. The document was not ambiguous. It was a policy distributed from the highest level of the organization, operationalized across 9 locations, and embedded in the compensation structure of the sales floor. Graham thanked Lila, confirmed the preservation demand had already been filed, and asked her to maintain her own copy of the email somewhere outside the company's network. He told her she had done nothing wrong that morning. She had, in fact, done the only right thing available to her, and that she should document everything she remembered in writing with timestamps before the details softened with time. Lila said she already had. She then mentioned, before she hung up, that the showroom's security camera footage was set to be automatically overwritten on a 48-hour cycle, and that if they wanted the original recording, not the archived management copy, they had perhaps 18 hours before it was gone. Graham noted the time and relayed it to Avery immediately. The preservation demand, already filed, covered the footage legally. Whether Sterling Crest would comply was a different question, but non-compliance now carried its own consequences. He then thought about the dashcam he had installed in the Mustang himself to test integration with Waypoint's fleet tracking software. It had been running since he pulled out of his garage that morning. He called Avery, and by 6:15 that evening she had reviewed the footage. The attendant's remark at the entrance, Chase's dismissal at the door, the cluster of salesmen gathering at the glass, Preston reading the business card aloud and placing it on the display hood, Lila's confirmation that the appointment existed, the instruction to remove Graham's name from the intake board, the threat to call the police if he didn't leave, and Preston's final remark, "Buy one car first." The audio had compression noise in certain ranges, and one angle was partially obstructed by the sun visor, but what it captured was more than sufficient to disprove every central claim in Sterling Crest's public statement. Avery did not release it. She sent a copy to Sterling Crest's legal team with a cover note that said Waypoint looked forward to resolving any remaining questions about the morning's events. Malcolm called Graham that evening, not to discuss the legal proceedings, but to acknowledge them directly. He confirmed that Sterling Crest had contacted the manufacturer's regional representative to request a review of the fleet pricing discounts Everett had extended to Waypoint, a move designed to destabilize the economics of Malcolm's contracts without attacking them legally. Malcolm offered Graham an exit from the agreement. If Waypoint needed to step back to avoid being drawn into a distributor dispute, Malcolm would facilitate a clean release without penalty. Graham said he wouldn't be doing that. Malcolm had shown him who his company was before knowing the size of the deal, and that information was the only thing that had mattered that morning. Malcolm said he understood, and then they talked about the delivery timeline for 20 minutes. When Graham arrived home, Paige was at the kitchen table with an article about the Sterling Crest situation open on her laptop. The comment section divided between people who believed Graham and people who were certain a wealthy man had driven a conspicuous old car into a luxury dealership as a calculated provocation designed to embarrass the brand for competitive advantage. She looked up and asked if he'd seen it. He said he had. She said the people who thought he'd staged the whole thing kept returning to the Mustang as if it were the evidence, as though no ordinary person actually just drove a 30-year-old car because it was their car and they wanted to. She asked if it would be simpler to sell it and stop giving people the opportunity to form the wrong impression. Graham sat down across from her and said the Mustang hadn't given anyone the opportunity to form the wrong impression. It had only made the impression visible that was already formed. Paige had found, earlier that afternoon while reaching into the glove box for a pen, a photograph she hadn't known existed. Her parents, younger than she had any memory of either of them, both wearing paint-stained clothes, standing beside the Mustang in what appeared to be a small rented garage somewhere, her mother mid-law at something out of frame. She had set the photo on the entry table when she came inside and hadn't moved it. She didn't say anything more about selling the car. Meanwhile, Preston had received a message through Adrian's assistant, informing him that an internal review was underway and that all senior staff were expected to prepare written accounts of the morning. He read the message twice. He had spent 8 years with the company, had increased Belridge's quarterly numbers for 6 of those years, had implemented the client profile scoring system at Adrian's direct request, and had trained his staff to apply it consistently. He had done, in other words, precisely what had been asked of him. The phrasing of the review notice, routed through an assistant, framed as an accounting exercise rather than a direct conversation, told him precisely what the review was being designed to produce. He was being positioned as the explanation. An explanation, once accepted, closes the investigation above it. Preston was experienced enough to recognize the architecture of a controlled narrative. He sat in his car in the Sterling Crest parking lot for several minutes, then called Leela from his personal phone and said he had an audio recording she might find useful. Conrad Sterling convened the emergency board session himself. He was 70 years old, had spent 4 decades building the Sterling Crest name into one of the most recognized automotive retail brands in the Mid-South, and had spent the past 2 years quietly troubled by an institutional drift he could feel but not yet name. A gradual shift in how the company carried itself, a certain hardness in the language of internal communications, a pattern of complaints he had been told were being addressed, when the records suggested they were being managed rather than resolved. The board assembled Thursday morning in the Nashville headquarters conference room, a space with floor-to-ceiling glass along one full wall overlooking the building's front approach and the street beyond. 9 board members, a legal observer, and 2 department heads were present. Adrian arrived first, which she had planned. Conrad arrived last, which everyone understood to mean something. Adrian presented first, characterizing Graham as a regional business owner who had escalated a minor customer service interaction into a calculated campaign against a family institution for personal and competitive reasons. She used the word manipulation 3 times. Conrad had asked Graham to attend. Graham drove up from Belridge in the Mustang, arrived without an assistant or a legal team, parked in the visitor lot at the front of the building, and walked in carrying a single leather folder. At approximately the same moment he entered the building, 25 vehicles, Waypoint Mobility's first operational fleet, freshly delivered from Everett's regional branches and marked in the company's blue and white livery, were moving in convoy along the road directly visible through the conference room's glass wall, heading from the staging lot to Waypoint's operations center 7 blocks north. The convoy moved at a deliberate pace, every vehicle identical in specification and marking, the column longer than the room had expected. The Mustang was visible in the visitor lot below. The 25 vehicles moved past the window. Nobody in the room needed those 2 images explained. Graham did not mention the convoy. When invited to speak, he described the morning at Sterling Crest factually, chronologically, and without emotional language. Avery joined by video and presented the documentation. The original calendar entry, the system change log with its precise timestamp, a transcript summary of the dashcam footage, the email sent under the subject line Client Experience Calibration, documentation of the retroactively inserted exclusivity clause. Records of Sterling Crest's subsequent contact with the manufacturer's distributor representative, and the legal correspondence asserting a breach that had never been agreed to in writing. Lila appeared on video under her own name and confirmed that Preston had directed the appointment's deletion and told her she would lose her position if she interfered. Adrian pivoted to Preston. His conduct that morning had exceeded any guidance she had given, she said. The showroom staff operated with broad autonomy. She regretted that the experience had not reflected Sterling Crest's standard. 18 minutes into her statement, Preston walked into the conference room. He was holding his phone. He played 31 seconds of audio. Adrian's voice, clear, recognized by everyone in the room, gave instructions for preparing an alternative account of the Waypoint visit that would characterize the client as the source of the disruption and protect the company's public position. Preston had made the recording from his car in the Sterling Crest parking lot 3 days earlier, when he had understood with sufficient clarity that the review being designed around him was not intended to discover the truth. Conrad Sterling sat at the head of the table and listened to all of it. When the recording ended, he asked Adrian a single question. How many other customers had been treated the way Graham Keene had been treated that morning, and simply hadn't had the resources to make anyone in this room listen? The independent audit that followed covered 9 locations and was given a scope broad enough to surface what had accumulated beneath years of carefully maintained metrics. What emerged was not a series of isolated incidents, but a structure, recognizable inconsistency explicable only as design. A retired schoolteacher in Memphis had been steered into a financing package she hadn't requested and hadn't understood until 3 payments had processed. A small business owner in Knoxville had had his credit application read aloud by a salesman to a colleague within earshot of other customers. A man in his early 70s had been told, in front of other people on the showroom floor, to consider something more appropriate for his budget after asking to test drive a flagship sedan. At least 11 formal complaints across 4 locations had been logged as resolved in the internal records without the customer having been contacted. Staff at multiple branches had maintained a recurring internal messaging thread where photographs of customers, taken without knowledge or consent, were shared under a subject line titled "Today's Floor." The email Lila had preserved connected every incident to the organization's leadership. Distributed to all 9 branch managers from Adrian's direct account under the subject line "Client Experience Calibration," it had been relayed into team meetings, incorporated into training sessions, and operationalized through a compensation structure that bonused staff for selling high-margin service packages to customers, scored above a threshold in the intake system. Clients scored below that threshold received fewer follow-up contacts, less favorable financing options when available, and shorter test drives as a matter of standard operational practice. The contempt had not been invented at the Belridge location by Preston Hale. It had been distributed, refined by use, and financially rewarded from the top of the organization. Adrian, in her final statement before the board voted, said she had built a premium brand and that premium brands made deliberate choices about the client experience they offered. She said the calibration referenced in the email meant consistency in training, not categorization of customers. She said what had happened in Belridge was a failure of individual execution. Graham said he had not come to debate definitions. The record showed what the policy had produced across 9 locations over several years, and Adrian had attempted to bury that record the moment it became inconvenient to acknowledge it. She was not being asked to step aside because a salesman had laughed at his car. She was being asked to step aside because she had converted that laughter into a management framework, distributed it across an organization, rewarded compliance with it financially, and then falsified documents when the outcomes surfaced publicly. The board voted 8-1 to suspend Adrian from the chief executive role pending full independent review. Preston Hale was terminated that afternoon. Chase Danner was placed on suspension pending the investigation's conclusion. Lila Benton was offered her position back under a newly drafted whistleblower protection policy. She declined. 2 days later, Malcolm called and offered her the directorship of corporate accounts at Everett Motor Collective. One of her first decisions was to draft a standing policy, 3 paragraphs, posted at every Everett location and included in every employee orientation, stating that no client's purchase capacity would be evaluated on the basis of the vehicle they arrived in, the clothing they wore, or any element of their appearance. Before the board session ended, Adrian told Graham he had destroyed a family legacy over a car. Graham said the legacy had done that to itself long before the Mustang pulled into the lot. Conrad Sterling sent a handwritten letter the following week, an actual letter on personal stationery, not a communication drafted by a team, acknowledging without qualification that the institution his family had built had drifted from the principles it was meant to represent. He apologized directly for the experience Graham had received and for the systematic treatment of other customers the audit had begun to uncover. He said he intended to dismantle the client profile scoring system, reopen every flagged complaint for personal review, close the incentive programs that had rewarded the sale of services customers hadn't needed, and begin a comprehensive leadership search. He asked, at the close of the letter, whether Graham might be willing to consider Sterling Crest as a vendor for future phases of Waypoint's fleet build-out, once the company had demonstrated over time that the consideration had been earned rather than assumed. Graham read the letter once, set it on his desk, and did not respond that week. Whether a response would come depended entirely on what Sterling Crest chose to become next, not on what it had promised. Waypoint's 25 vehicles entered service on schedule 47 hours after the contracts were signed. Airport pickups, hospital transfer circuits, and corporate shuttle loops through the Belridge Technology District, running the first routes on a Friday morning that began without ceremony and without incident. Graham was not at the operations center for the launch. He had never particularly valued ceremonies. 3 days later, he drove the Mustang to the hub to sign quarterly insurance filings, and Paige was with him. She walked the full length of the 2 vehicle rows slowly, counting each one. At the far end, she turned and asked which car was his. He pointed toward the edge of the lot where the Mustang sat alone on the asphalt, apart from the row. She said it looked out of place next to all of those new ones. He said it knew exactly where it belonged. One evening in the second week of operations, Graham stopped at a small auto parts shop on the south side of Belridge for a connector for the Mustang's climate control module. $9, a part a young employee located in under 2 minutes after Graham described it. The employee came out from behind the counter, looked at the car with interest rather than assessment, asked if there was anything else Graham needed, and said goodbye when he left. No laughter at the door, no inventory of his clothing or judgment about the car's age. Just a transaction between 2 people, handled the way transactions are supposed to be handled when no one is performing anything. Graham paid, said thank you, and drove south through the city toward home, the Mustang's engine settling into its familiar, unhurried rhythm. He passed the Sterling Crest lot on the way. The showroom lights were still on. Cars gleamed behind the glass. He did not stop. He drove home in a car he had been driving for 25 years, carrying a $9 part, and the clarity of a man who had spent the morning discovering everything he needed to know about 2 different businesses, and himself. He had signed contracts for 25 vehicles before noon. The math of that day was not complicated. What a business eventually gives back to you depends entirely on who it decided to be in the moment before it knew what you were worth.